Welcome, dear listener, to an enchanting tale of village intrigue and gentle deduction. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a cup of Earl Grey, and allow Miss Jane Marple to guide you through the leafy lanes of St. Mary Mead. In fatal tea in Heatherbank Cottage, a single sip of afternoon tea will unravel secrets long buried beneath roses and respectability. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Unwelcome Leaf. The last Tuesday in August 1952 had dawned with a languid honey-colored light that seemed to settle like pollen on the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead. It was the sort of day when even the bees moved slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the hush that lay over the village between the morning post and the evening's first owl. Heatherbank Cottage stood at the far end of the lane that curved away from the church like a question mark. Its walls were washed the pale pink of early dawn, and its garden, Mrs. Lavinia Proctor's pride, spilled over the low stone wall in a riot of late summer color. Delphiniums the blue of a soldier's coat, roses heavy with scent, and along the bank that gave the cottage its name, a thick tangle of heather and hemlock growing so companionably together that only a botanist or a poisoner might tell them apart. Inside the cottage, the air was thick with the fragrance of Darjeeling and warm scones. The drawing-room windows stood open to the garden, and a breeze stirred the lace curtains so gently that they seemed to breathe. At the center of the room, beneath a crystal chandelier that had once belonged to a minor duchess, stood a round mahogany table laid for tea with the precision of a military parade. Mrs. Lavinia Proctor presided. She was 83, upright as a church candle, and dressed in the lavender bombazine she had worn every Tuesday since 1937. Her silver hair was coiled beneath a lace cap. Her hands, knotted with age but steady, rested on the handle of a Crown Derby teapot painted with forget-me-nots. Around the table sat the usual circle, 5 guests who had attended these teas for years, bound by habit, gossip, and the unspoken rules of village life. Nearest the window, in a chintz armchair that had once been her mother's, sat Miss Jane Marple. She was knitting something small and lavender, perhaps a premature gift for a great niece, and her needles clicked with the soft regularity of a clock. Her gray eyes, mild behind rimless spectacles, missed nothing. She had been invited, as always, to make up the numbers, though everyone knew Mrs. Proctor valued her quiet observations more than she admitted. To Miss Marple's left lounged Colonel Bantry, retired from the Indian Army and still ruddy with the sun of Simla. He had arrived in a tweed jacket that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and dog, and he was already reaching for his third scone. "Damn fine spread, Lavinia," he boomed, crumbs tumbling into his mustache. "Reminds me of the club in Pune." Opposite him, Dr. Haydock adjusted his spectacles and helped himself to a sliver of Victoria sponge. He was a thin, precise man with a voice like dry leaves, and he had been the village doctor for 30 years. "You spoil us, Mrs. Proctor," he murmured, though his eyes flicked to the sugar bowl with the wariness of a man who had seen too many diabetics. Miss Hartnell, the village busybody, sat ramrod straight in a chair that creaked beneath her angular frame. She wore a hat adorned with a single artificial cherry, and her lips were pursed in perpetual disapproval. "I hear the new postmistress has been seen cycling after dark," she announced to the room at large. "Most improper." Young Mr. Clement, the curate, flushed to the roots of his sandy hair. He was 26, earnest, and perpetually worried about the state of the church organ. I'm sure there's an innocent explanation," he stammered, nearly upsetting his saucer. He had been invited because Mrs. Proctor was a generous donor to the Restoration Fund, and because his aunt in Tunbridge Wells had once been at school with her. Gladys, the maid, moved silently around the table with a fresh pot. She was 19, small-boned, with auburn curls escaping her cap. She had been in service at Heatherbank Cottage for 6 months, ever since her mother took ill, and she still flinched when Mrs. Proctor's voice sharpened. "Another cup, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Proctor asked, tilting the teapot with the grace of long practice. "Just half, thank you, Lavinia," Miss Marple replied. "One mustn't overindulge before the Women's Institute." The conversation drifted like the steam from the cups. Colonel Bantry recounted a tiger hunt in 22. Dr. Haydock warned about the dangers of unpasteurized milk. Miss Hartnell dissected the moral character of the butcher's wife. Mr. Clement tried to steer the talk toward the upcoming harvest festival, but his voice was drowned by the Colonel's laughter. Mrs. Proctor listened with the faint smile of one who has heard it all before. She lifted her own cup, delicately painted with violets, and added 2 lumps of sugar from the Wedgwood bowl at her elbow. She stirred once, twice, the spoon tinkling against porcelain like a distant bell. Then she raised the cup to her lips. The first sip was unremarkable. The second brought a faint frown to her brow. She paused, the cup halfway to her mouth again, and her eyes narrowed as if tasting something unexpected beneath the bergamot. A third sip, and her hand trembled. The cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the saucer with a sound like breaking ice. A faint, acrid scent, bitter almonds, curled above the steam. "Lavinia?" Miss Marple's needles stilled. Mrs. Proctor clutched her throat. "The tea. Bitter." Her voice was a thread. Her eyes rolled white. She slid from the chair in a rustle of bombazine and lay still upon the Persian rug, one hand outstretched as if reaching for the fallen cup. For a moment the room was suspended in silence, as though the world had forgotten how to move. Then chaos erupted. Dr. Haydock was on his knees beside her in an instant, fingers at her neck, ear to her chest. Pulse thready, respiration failing. He looked up, face grim. Cyanide. Potassium cyanide in the sugar bowl. Colonel Bantry's scone fell to the carpet. "Good God!" Miss Hartnell gave a shrill cry and pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Mr. Clement stood frozen, tea slopping over his cuff. Gladys dropped the teapot. It bounced, miraculously unbroken, and rolled beneath the table. Miss Marple alone remained seated. She regarded the dainty porcelain bowl, its contents glittering innocently in the sunlight. Someone, she reflected, had sweetened death with 2 lumps. Dr. Haydock was already loosening Mrs. Proctor's collar, tilting her head, but his movements grew slower. The gestures of a man who knows the battle is lost. "She's gone," he said at last, voice flat. "Less than 2 minutes." The Colonel found his voice. "But who takes sugar? Only Lavinia. The rest of us—" "Take milk," Miss Marple finished quietly. "Yes, I noticed." Inspector Craddock would not arrive for another hour, summoned from Much Benham by a telephone call that crackled with village panic. In the meantime, the drawing room became a tableau of shock. Gladys was sent to fetch brandy. She returned with shaking hands and a decanter that sloshed over the tray. Miss Hartnell rocked back and forth, muttering about murder most foul. Mr. Clement attempted prayer, but the words tangled in his throat. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and moved to the table. She lifted the sugar bowl with the corner of her handkerchief and peered inside. The sugar was fine, white, ordinary, except for a faint bluish tint at one edge where the crystals had melted slightly and recrystallized. She set it down carefully. "Colonel," she said, "did you notice anyone near the bowl before tea was poured?" Bantry blinked. Well, Gladys filled it, didn't she? From the pantry tin." Gladys shook her head violently. "I never, sir. Mrs. Proctor weighed the sugar herself every Monday, 2 pounds exact. I only carried the bowl." Dr. Haydock stood, wiping his hands on a napkin. "The dose was massive. A teaspoon would suffice. Someone knew Lavinia's habit precisely." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the open window. The garden beyond was a riot of color, but along the bank, there, half hidden by heather, grew a clump of hemlock, its white umbels nodding in the breeze. She had noticed it weeks ago when Mrs. Proctor had pointed it out with pride. Conium maculatum, the old lady had said. Deadly, but so like cow parsley. One must be careful. Careful indeed. The clock on the mantel struck 4. Outside, a blackbird sang as if nothing had happened. Inside, 5 people stared at the body of their hostess and wondered which of them had measured out death in a porcelain bowl. Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. The needles began to click again, soft and steady. She had seen murder before. Too often, perhaps, for a woman who preferred geraniums to gore, but never in a room that smelled of Darjeeling and warm scones. Somewhere in this circle of familiar faces, she thought, lay a secret as bitter as the almond scent that still lingered in the air. The tea had cooled. The scones would go stale, and Heatherbank Cottage, for the first time in 50 years, would not serve tea next Tuesday. Chapter 2. The Circle of Suspects. By 5:30, the sun had slipped behind the yew hedge, and the drawing-room of Heatherbank Cottage lay in a hush broken only by the ticking of the bracket clock and the occasional creak of floorboards under police boots. Inspector Dermot Craddock had arrived from Much Benham with the brisk efficiency of a man who preferred London traffic to village lanes. He was tall, dark, and quietly exasperated. His trilby still carried the crease of the train journey. A constable in uniform stood by the door, notebook poised like a hymnal. Mrs. Proctor's body had been removed on a stretcher beneath a clean white sheet. The Persian rug bore a darker patch where tea and death had mingled. The sugar bowl, now sealed in a glass jar, sat on the sideboard like evidence at an inquest. Miss Marple sat in the same chintz armchair, knitting resumed, though the lavender square had grown no larger. She watched the inspector with the mild interest she might give to a new curate. Craddock cleared his throat. I understand 5 guests were present, all took tea. Only the deceased took sugar, correct? 5 heads nodded. Gladys hovered in the doorway, apron twisted between her fingers. Then we begin with opportunity, Craddock continued. The bowl was on the table from the moment tea was poured. Anyone could have added the poison during the preceding half hour. Colonel Bantry gave a bark of indignation. Steady on, Inspector. You're not suggesting one of us. I'm suggesting nothing, sir, merely establishing facts. Craddock's voice was courteous steel. Let us start with motives. In a village this size, secrets rarely stay buried. Miss Marple's needles clicked. Quite so, Inspector. Though in St. Mary Mead we prefer to call them understandings. Craddock allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Then let us understand the understandings. He began with the colonel. Motive surfaced like a trout in the village pond. Mrs. Proctor had lent the colonel $500 in 1946 to cover gambling debts from a disastrous bridge evening at the golf club. The loan was interest-free, but pride had prevented repayment. Until last month, when Lavinia issued a gentle reminder in the form of a letter delivered by hand. The envelope, half burned in the kitchen grate, had been retrieved by the constable. Return the sum by Michaelmas, or I fear the truth must out. L.P. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was an indiscretion in Simla, 1919, an affair with a married woman whose husband had since become a bishop. Exposure would finish the colonel standing at the British Legion. Colonel Bantry blustered. Poppycock. Lavinia and I settled it over brandy last week. She tore up the IOU herself. Yet the charred fragments in the grate told another story. The doctor's motive was professional ruin. Mrs. Proctor had discovered that Haydock was prescribing morphine to wealthy widows for nerves, then charging exorbitantly for house calls. She had threatened to report him to the British Medical Association. Clue. A chemist's invoice, folded small in the doctor's medical bag for potassium cyanide, photographic use. Haydock explained that he developed his own x-rays in the surgery darkroom, but the quantity, 5 ounces, was enough to fell a regiment. Miss Marple noted the invoice was dated 3 weeks ago, the same day Mrs. Proctor had complained of a curious taste in her bedtime cocoa. The spinster's grievance was rooted in property. She occupied the End Almshouse cottage, rent-free, a charity of Mrs. Proctor's late husband. Last spring, Lavinia had discovered Miss Hartnell was subletting the spare room to a commercial traveler for 5 shillings a night. An eviction notice, dated tomorrow, had been found torn in Miss Hartnell's handbag. Miss Hartnell bristled. "Lavinia forgave me," said Christian charity demanded it. Yet the notice bore Mrs. Proctor's signature in ink that had not yet dried when the constable examined it. The curate's motive was matrimonial blackmail. Mrs. Proctor had offered $200 toward the church organ restoration, on condition that Mr. Clement marry her niece Clarissa, a girl with a laugh like a hyena and a dowry of $40 a year. Clement had refused in a letter discovered in his cassock pocket. "I would sooner burn the organ than wed that harridan." He flushed crimson. I did write it, but Mrs. Proctor withdrew the condition only yesterday. Said blood was thicker than incense. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Blood, perhaps, but whose? Gladys had been dismissed without reference the previous Thursday for insolence after dropping a spode plate. She had returned on Monday, begged back because the agency sent no replacement. Mrs. Proctor had relented, but Gladys nursed a grievance. Clue, size 6 boot prints in the soft earth beneath the scullery window, leading away from the house. Gladys wore 4s. The prints were fresh, made after the morning dew. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "You were here throughout, ma'am. Did you observe anything unusual?" Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. "Several things, Inspector. First, the sugar bowl was refilled after Mrs. Proctor weighed her Monday portion. Gladys carried it from the pantry already brimming, yet Lavinia always insisted on precisely 2 pounds. Gladys gasped. "I never—" "Second," Miss Marple continued serenely, "the footprints. They lead away from the window, not toward it. An intruder would enter to tamper, then leave. These suggest someone exited after the deed, carrying something away, perhaps the original sugar." Dr. Haydock frowned. "But the cyanide—" "Was added after the bowl reached the table," Miss Marple said. "Observe the crystals. Where the poison melted them, the grains are coarser, recrystallized. Someone sprinkled it during the confusion of pouring, when all eyes were on the teapot." Colonel Bantry harumphed. "But who—" Miss Marple lifted the shattered cup with her handkerchief. Inside the rim clung a single pale green leaf, no larger than a 6pence, curled as if by steam. "Hemlock," she said softly. "Conium maculatum. Grows along the bank outside. The leaf could not have floated in. The windows were open, but the breeze blows out. It was placed deliberately after the tea was poured to suggest a garden accident." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Then the cyanide—" "Was in the sugar," Miss Marple finished. "But the leaf was misdirection. Someone wished us to look to the garden, not the pantry." The inspector made a note. "And the boot prints?" "Borrowed boots," Miss Marple murmured. "The colonel keeps a spare pair in the scullery, size 6, for his gardener. They were returned muddy this morning." Colonel Bantry stared. "By Jove, I thought the fellow was slacking." Gladys began to cry. "I never touched the sugar, I swear. Mrs. Proctor weighed it Monday like always. I only carried the bowl." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand. "No one is accusing you, child. Yet." Craddock closed his notebook. "We'll need statements from each of you. And the pantry tin, sealed for fingerprints." As the suspects filed out into the dusk, Miss Marple lingered by the window. The hemlock swayed, innocent as parsley. Somewhere in the circle of familiar faces, she thought, lay a hand steady enough to measure death in teaspoons, and a heart cold enough to serve it with scones. The clock struck 6. Outside, the blackbird had fallen silent. Chapter 3. The Garden Interlude. The morning after the tragedy dawned with a crispness that belied the horror of the previous day. A light mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, veiling the village in a soft gray that muffled the clang of the milkman's bottles and the distant lowing of cows from Gossington Farm. Heatherbank Cottage stood silent, its windows shuttered like closed eyes. A black wreath already hung on the door by the undertaker's boy. Police tape fluttered across the gate, but the garden, Mrs. Proctor's beloved garden, bloomed on, oblivious, its roses heavy with dew and the heather along the bank shimmering purple in the pale light. Miss Jane Marple set out for her constitutional at precisely 8:30, as was her habit. She wore a sensible tweed coat against the autumn chill, a woolen scarf knotted at her throat, and carried a small basket for any windfalls she might encounter along the lane. Her steps were measured, unhurried. She paused now and then to admire a late-blooming Michaelmas daisy or to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Price at the post office, who was still pale from the news. "Shocking, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price whispered, leaning over the counter. "Poison in the sugar. Who would have thought it in St. Mary Mead?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though one recalls similar occurrences elsewhere. Human nature, my dear, is much the same in villages as in cities." She continued on, her mind turning over the events of the tea like a hand of patience. The cyanide in the sugar, undeniable according to Dr. Haydock's preliminary tests. The hemlock leaf in the cup, a deliberate plant, she was certain. And those boot prints beneath the scullery window, size 6, leading away. Borrowed boots, perhaps. But borrowed by whom? As she approached Heatherbank Cottage, she noted Inspector Craddock's Morris parked askew on the verge, its bonnet still warm. The inspector himself was in the garden, crouched by the flower bed with a magnifying glass, his constable photographing the prints from various angles. The earth had softened overnight with dew, preserving the impressions clearly. A man's tread deep in the heel, as if the wearer had paused to peer through the window. "Morning, Miss Marple," Craddock called, straightening with a grimace. His back, she recalled, troubled him after long drives. "Out for a stroll?" "One must keep the circulation going, Inspector," she said, peering over the gate. "Though I confess the cottage draws one like a magnet. Poor Lavinia, she was so proud of her hemlock." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Hemlock? You mean the weed?" "Conium maculatum," Miss Marple confirmed. "Deadly poison, but she grew it for the bees. They adore the umbels. She often said it reminded her of cow parsley from her childhood rambles." The inspector glanced at the bank. "And that leaf in the cup, could it have blown in?" "Unlikely. The breeze was outward, and the leaf was curled inside the rim, adhered by steam. No, it was placed there after pouring." Craddock nodded thoughtfully. "The lab confirmed cyanide in the sugar residues, enough to kill instantly. But the leaf, misdirection, you think?" "Precisely. To suggest an accident, a careless gathering from the garden." At that moment, Colonel Bantry emerged from the side path, secateurs in hand, his face florid beneath his cap. He had been granted permission to tend the roses. Mrs. Proctor's will apparently named him executor of the garden until probate. "Ghastly business," he barked, snipping a deadhead with unnecessary force. The bloom fell like a severed head. "Lavinia always took 2 lumps. Damned careless, leaving poison about." Miss Marple regarded him serenely. "Yet the bowl was full, Colonel. Brimming, one might say." Gladys carried it from the pantry already filled, though Lavinia weighed her sugar meticulously every Monday. The Colonel's secateurs paused mid-snip. "Eh? What's that got to do with it?" "Someone refilled it after Monday," Miss Marple explained. "Added the poison then, perhaps. Or later." Bantry harumphed, clipping another rose. "Well, I didn't touch the blasted stuff. Hate sugar ruins the teeth." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to his boots. Sturdy brogues, size 9, caked with fresh mud from the path. Not size 6. But in the scullery, she recalled, hung a spare pair, smaller for the gardener who came Tuesdays. Inside the cottage, the air still held a faint echo of Darjeeling and tragedy. Gladys was in the scullery, weeping into her apron as she polished silver that would never again grace the tea table. Dr. Haydock had called earlier, ostensibly to collect his medical bag left behind, but Miss Marple suspected he sought reassurance. She found the maid on her knees, scrubbing the flagstones where the teapot had spilled. "Gladys, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "dry your eyes. No one blames you yet." The girl looked up, auburn curls escaping her cap. "I never touched the sugar, miss. Mrs. Proctor weighed it herself, 2 pounds in the blue tin. I only carried the bowl to the table." Miss Marple knelt beside her, ignoring the protest of her knees. "And the pantry window, was it open Monday?" Gladys nodded miserably. "Always for the air, but I locked it Tuesday morning like she said." The window in question overlooked the flower bed. Miss Marple peered out. The boot prints began just below the sill, leading away toward the compost heap. Away, not toward. An intruder would enter, tamper, exit. But these suggested someone leaving after placing something inside. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, as if the poisoner fled with the evidence. "The original sugar, perhaps." Gladys sniffled. "Or the hemlock." Mrs. Proctor kept a basket for weeds by the door. Miss Marple straightened. "Did anyone visit Monday? After the weighing?" "Only Mr. Clement," Gladys said. "Came about the organ fund, stayed 10 minutes in the drawing room." "The curate." Miss Marple filed it away. Venturing into the garden proper, she encountered Miss Hartnell, who had arrived under pretext of returning a borrowed book on embroidery. The spinster was plucking wilted leaves from the delphiniums with sharp, angry tugs. "Disgraceful," she declared upon sighting Miss Marple. "Murder in a Christian home, and that eviction notice, pure forgery. Lavinia forgave my little arrangement weeks ago." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Arrangement?" Miss Hartnell flushed beneath her hat's cherry. "The room. The traveler paid honestly. Lavinia said charity began at home." Yet the torn notice in her handbag suggested otherwise. Miss Marple noted the soil on Miss Hartnell's gloves. Fresh from the flower bed, perhaps. Dr. Haydock appeared next, medical bag in hand, his thin face drawn. "Miss Marple, can't sleep a wink. That invoice, purely for x-rays, I assure you." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "though 5 ounces is generous for photographs." He adjusted his spectacles. "One must be prepared, and Lavinia, she'd been complaining of tastes in her food. Imagined, perhaps." "Or not," Miss Marple replied. "The hemlock leaf, was it from the bank?" Haydock glanced at the tangle of plants. "Identical, but cyanide isn't botanical." "No, synthesized. From a chemist, perhaps." The doctor's hand tightened on his bag. Inspector Craddock joined them, pocketing his glass. "Prints are clear. Ridged pattern, common hobnail. The spare boots in the scullery match exactly, borrowed and returned." Colonel Bantry, overhearing, boomed, "My gardeners, the lazy blighter must have—" "But your gardener is in hospital," Craddock interrupted. "Appendicitis, since Friday." A silence fell, broken only by the buzz of a late bee. Miss Marple wandered to the compost heap where the boot prints ended. There, half buried under potato peelings, lay a crumpled glove, ladies' kid leather stained with sugar crystals and a faint blue residue. Size small. Miss Hartnell's? No. Gladys wore small, but her gloves were cotton. This was finer. And then, a glint. A single white hair caught on a rose thorn nearby. Not Gladys's auburn, nor Miss Hartnell's iron gray. Mrs. Proctor's own had been snow white, but she hadn't gardened in years. "Inspector?" Miss Marple called softly. "Another clue." As Craddock examined the glove, Mr. Clement arrived, bicycle clip still on his trousers, face earnest. I must confess. The letter about the organ, I burned a check, yes, but Lavinia forgave me, said she'd donate anonymously. His boots, clerical black, size 8, not 6. Yet his eyes darted to the hemlock. Miss Marple smiled inwardly. The circle tightened. Someone had borrowed boots, planted a leaf, sweetened sugar with death. But why the misdirection? To frame the garden, or to hide a pantry intrusion? The mist began to lift, revealing the village in sharp relief. The church spire, the vicarage chimney smoking lazily. St. Mary Mead with its secrets buried shallow as bulbs. As Miss Marple resumed her walk, basket swinging, she reflected. Parallels abound in village life. Like the case of the poisoned chutney in 37, or was it 42, human frailty disguised as habit. The boot prints, she decided, were the key. Borrowed by one who knew the house intimately. And the glove, left in haste. By luncheon, the news would ripple. Fingerprints on the pantry tin, none but Gladys's, and hers only on the lid. Chapter 4. The Photograph Album. Wednesday broke with a thin, reluctant sun that struggled through the lace curtains of Heatherbank Cottage as though reluctant to witness what lay within. The police had finished their dawn-to-dusk measurements. The drawing room smelled faintly of fingerprint powder and cold tea. Miss Marple arrived at 10 sharp, invited by Inspector Craddock for a woman's eye. She carried a small tin of shortbread, comfort for Gladys, whose eyes were swollen like risen dough. Craddock met her in the hall, trilby in hand. "We've lifted prints from the pantry tin. Only the maid's, on the lid. The sugar itself was handled with gloves, and the boot prints end at the compost heap. No return trail." Miss Marple nodded. As if the borrower intended a single journey. Out with the poison, away with the evidence. They moved to the drawing room. The table had been cleared, but the Wedgwood sugar bowl sat in solitary state beneath a glass dome, awaiting the laboratory van. On the piano, Mrs. Proctor's photograph album lay open where Dr. Haydock had left it the previous evening, ostensibly to identify a snapshot of the colonel in Simla. The inspector flipped a page. Haydock claims he was developing old negatives for Mrs. Proctor. Sentimental, he says. Yet the cyanide invoice matches the date she first complained of bitter tastes. Miss Marple bent over the album. The photograph in question showed a younger Colonel Bantry, arms slung around a laughing woman in a solar topee. On the back, in Lavinia's spidery copperplate, Simla, 1919. Payment in full or publication? She turned the page. Another picture. The Colonel again, this time presenting a silver cup at the Much Benham Flower Show, 1948. Penciled beneath 500 repaid. The Colonel had spoken truth. He had settled the debt. Yet the half-burned letter in the grate suggested someone wished the village to believe otherwise. "Someone is forging Mrs. Proctor's hand," Miss Marple murmured. First the eviction notice in Miss Hartnell's bag. Now this annotation contradicted by the earlier note. Craddock's eyes narrowed. A campaign of misdirection. Gladys appeared with a tray. Tea for the inspector, barley water for Miss Marple. "Cook sent seed cake, miss. Said Mrs. Proctor would have wanted the house kept proper." Miss Marple accepted a slice. "You were in the pantry Monday afternoon, Gladys, after the sugar was weighed." The girl nodded. Mrs. Proctor locked the tin herself, said she'd not have waste. Then Mr. Clement called. About the organ. I showed him in, then went to the scullery. Alone? Craddock asked. 5 minutes, no more. The window was open for air. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the scullery door. The spare boots, size 6, hung on their hook, freshly brushed but still bearing a trace of compost soil inside the left toe. Someone had worn them in haste, perhaps left-footed. Upstairs in Mrs. Proctor's bedroom, the desk had been searched. The middle drawer yielded a second album, smaller, leather-bound, labeled private. Inside, pressed flowers, dance cards, and a single page torn from a ledger. The entry dated last Michaelmas Organ Fund, 200 anonymous. Mr. Clement's motive, too, dissolved like sugar in rain. Downstairs again, Miss Hartnell burst in without knocking, hat askew, clutching a tapestry bag. I must speak to the inspector. That eviction notice, forged. Lavinia promised me the cottage for life. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You tore it up? I most certainly did not. She opened her bag. Scraps of paper fluttered out like confetti. Found these in my embroidery basket this morning. Someone planted them. The fragments, when pieced together, read, Almshouse Cottage. Rent waived indefinitely. LP. Another forgery designed to incriminate, then discredit. Miss Marple examined the scraps. The ink was fresh, the paper identical to Mrs. Proctor's note paper in the desk. Our poisoner is thorough, she said. He, or she, creates motives, then destroys them, keeping us chasing shadows. Dr. Haydock arrived next, medical bag clutched like a shield. I've brought the negatives, he announced, producing a packet. Lavinia wanted copies for her memoirs, nothing sinister. The negatives were indeed Simla, sepia scenes of polo matches and hill stations. But one envelope held a single glass plate, a close-up of the sugar bowl taken yesterday, crystals sparkling. On the back, in pencil, for the inquest. Curious, Miss Marple said. Why photograph evidence before the police? Haydock flushed. I thought to preserve the scene. Professional habit. Miss Marple turned to the mantelpiece. There, in a silver frame, stood a portrait of Mrs. Proctor at 60, proud, upright, eyes sharp. Behind her on the wall hung a watercolor of Heatherbank Cottage painted by a local artist. The garden was rendered in loving detail. Roses, delphiniums, and along the bank, hemlock clearly labeled in the corner, Conium maculatum, beware. She lifted the frame. On the back, taped inside the cardboard, was a folded sheet. Mrs. Proctor's handwriting, dated last week. To whom it may concern, the hemlock is for the bees. Any other use is malice. L.P. Craddock whistled. She suspected poisoning. Or prank, Miss Marple corrected. But the leaf in the cup was no prank. Gladys, hovering, suddenly gasped. The glove! The one in the compost. I wore kid gloves Sunday mending the Colonel's driving pair. Left them on the scullery shelf. They're gone. Craddock strode to the compost heap, dug beneath the peelings. The glove was there, sugar-stained, a single white hair caught in the seam, Mrs. Proctor's hair. Miss Marple held it to the light. Placed deliberately. Our murderer is staging a passion play. Motive, means, misdirection. The inspector closed his notebook. Then every suspect is both guilty and innocent. Precisely, Miss Marple said. The question is not who had motive, but who had none. Until the forger created it. Outside, the sun climbed higher, gilding the hemlock. Somewhere in the village, a clock struck 11. The tea circle was fractured, but the game had only begun. Chapter 5. The curate's confession. Thursday morning found St. Mary Mead wrapped in a damp silver haze that turned the churchyard yews into morning sentinels. Miss Marple, undeterred by the weather, walked the long way round to the vicarage, her umbrella furled like a sword she hoped not to use. She had spent the night knitting and thinking. 2 needles, 1 pattern, many threads. Mr. Clement was in the garden, raking leaves with the mechanical fervor of a man trying to outrun conscience. His cassock was mud-splashed, his sandy hair stuck to his forehead. When he saw Miss Marple at the gate, the rake slipped from his hands. "Miss Marple, I was coming to find you." "Were you indeed?" She stepped through the wicket, closing it with a soft click. "Then let us sit. Wet grass is bad for the rheumatism." They settled on the bench beneath the vicarage apple tree. A robin scolded from the hedge. Mr. Clement twisted his dog collar until the starch cracked. "It's about the letter. The one in my pocket. I did write it, every furious word. Sooner burn the organ than wed that harridan. But I burned the check myself the very next day. Couldn't bear the thought of Clarissa's laugh echoing through the vestry." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "And Mrs. Proctor? She forgave me. Said blood was thicker than incense, and anyway the organ fund had received an anonymous gift, £200 in 5s and 10s. She showed me the ledger. It's gone now, of course." "Conveniently," Miss Marple murmured, along with the Simla photograph's annotation and Miss Hartnell's waiver. The curate's eyes widened. "You think someone is manufacturing motives? I think someone is weaving a tapestry of suspicion, then cutting the threads as we reach for them." She opened her handbag and produced the kid glove from the compost heap, now wrapped in tissue. "This was found yesterday. Sugar crystals in the fingertips, a white hair, Mrs. Proctor's caught in the seam. Yet Gladys swears she left her own gloves on the scullery shelf Sunday. These are finer leather, almost new." Mr. Clement stared. "Not mine. I wear dogskin for gardening." Miss Marple tucked the glove away. "Tell me about Monday afternoon. You visited Heatherbank Cottage." 10 minutes, no more. Mrs. Proctor wanted to discuss the harvest festival. "I noticed the sugar bowl on the sideboard, full to the brim. She said Gladys had been careless, overfilled it. I thought nothing of it." Miss Marple's needles appeared as if by magic. Lavender wool began to grow. "And the pantry window?" "Open. I remarked on the draft." Mrs. Proctor laughed, said hemlock kept the flies away. A silence fell, broken only by the rustle of leaves. Somewhere in the village a clock struck the quarter. "There is another matter," Mr. Clement said at last. "Last night someone raked the flower bed smooth, the boot prints gone. I saw the marks fresh at dusk, but by moonlight they were obliterated. I thought the police—" "They did not," Miss Marple finished. "Inspector Craddock's men finished at 6. The rake was returned to the tool shed, handle wiped clean." The curate paled. "Then the murderer returned." "Or never left." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Someone who knows the cottage intimately. Where the spare boots hang, where the gloves are kept, where the rake leans against the potting shed." Mr. Clement stood abruptly. "I must tell the inspector, in good time." She laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. "First, show me the vestry." The church was cool and dim, smelling of candle wax and damp stone. In the vestry, a small fire smoldered in the grate, parish accounts perhaps, or hymn sheets. Mr. Clement opened the safe. Inside lay the organ fund collection box, still sealed, and a single envelope addressed in Mrs. Proctor's hand. "For the curate, open after my death." With trembling fingers he broke the seal, a bank draft for $200 and a note. "Blood is thicker, but music is eternal. Use it well." "LP," Miss Marple read over his shoulder. She planned to announce it at the next tea. Someone ensured she never would. Back in the garden, the mist had lifted. Sunlight slanted through the apple branches, striping the bench like prison bars. "One more thing," Miss Marple said. "The hemlock leaf in the cup. It was curled left, clockwise. Hemlock wilts that way naturally, but the leaf was pressed flat, then released. Someone gathered it hours earlier, kept it in a book perhaps, to plant at the perfect moment. Mr. Clement swallowed. I have a pressed flower album in the vestry for the Sunday school. They returned. The album lay on the windowsill. Violets, pansies, and between pages 14 and 15, a single hemlock umbel, still fragrant, curled exactly as in the cup. "But I pressed this weeks ago," the curate cried, "for a lesson on poisonous plants." Miss Marple closed the book gently. "Then someone borrowed your specimen, Mr. Clement, just as they borrowed the Colonel's boots, Gladys's gloves, Dr. Haydock's invoice." She paused at the vestry door. "You burned a second letter, did you not?" "After the first was discovered." He nodded miserably. "A forgery. Same hand as the eviction notice. It accused me of stealing from the poor box. I thought to protect the parish." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Our poisoner is generous with ink and imagination. But imagination leaves traces, paper, pressure, the slant of a pen." Outside, the church clock struck 11. The village stirred. Mrs. Price at the post office sorting letters, Colonel Bantry marching to the British Legion, Miss Hartnell knitting furiously on her doorstep. Miss Marple walked homeward, basket swinging. The glove, the leaf, the raked earth, each a breadcrumb leading not to a witch's house but to a villager's heart. At her gate, Inspector Craddock waited, raincoat glistening. "The lab report, Miss Marple, cyanide definite, but the dose in the sugar was diluted, enough to sicken, not kill instantly." Mrs. Proctor's heart gave out from shock. Miss Marple nodded. "Suggestion is a powerful poison, Inspector, especially when one believes oneself targeted." She glanced back toward the church. "Our murderer did not intend instant death, only fear, and fear killed her." Craddock followed her gaze. "Then the real weapon was the forged motives." "Precisely. Someone wished Mrs. Proctor to die believing her friends betrayed her. A cruelty finer than cyanide." The sun broke fully through, gilding the lane. Somewhere, a blackbird began to sing. Chapter 6. The second tea Friday noon, and Heatherbank Cottage wore the hush of a house that has forgotten how to breathe. The police tape was gone. The wreath on the door had begun to wilt. Yet the drawing-room table was set once more. 6 cups, 6 saucers, a fresh Crown Derby pot steaming gently. Inspector Craddock had insisted on a reconstruction. "We pour tea exactly as before," he said, "and watch who flinches." The 5 survivors arrived punctually, summoned by notes delivered at dawn. Colonel Bantry in tweeds and thundercloud mood, Dr. Haydock pale beneath his spectacles, Miss Hartnell clutching her tapestry bag like a lifebelt, Mr. Clement twisting his dog collar, Gladys trembling in a clean apron. Miss Marple sat in her usual chintz chair, knitting needles, silent for once. Craddock stood at the mantel. "The sugar bowl is new, Wedgwood again, filled this morning from a sealed tin. No poison, but we proceed as Tuesday." Gladys pours. The maid's hand shook as she lifted the pot. Steam curled like incense. One by one the cups were filled. The sugar bowl, placed exactly where it had been, glittered innocently. Colonel Bantry reached first. "Dash it, man, I take milk." He stirred vigorously, then paused. His face purpled. "Salt. The blasted stuff is salt." The bowl was passed. Each guest tasted. Salt, coarse and unmistakable. Miss Hartnell shrieked. Mr. Clement dropped his spoon with a clatter. Dr. Haydock sniffed, professional. "Sodium chloride. Harmless but deliberate." Craddock's eyes swept the room. Someone entered the pantry overnight and swapped the contents. The tin was locked. Key on Mrs. Proctor's ring, now in police custody. So how? Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. "The scullery window, Inspector. Latched, not locked. A thin blade could lift it. Gladys gasped. I checked it Wednesday, sworn I did. You checked the latch, Miss Marple corrected gently. But the putty around the pane is old. A glazier's knife could remove a square, reach in, unhook. The pane was replaced, fingerprints on the fresh putty, inside only. Someone wearing gloves again. Craddock produced a small evidence bag. A single grain of salt, larger than the rest, bearing a faint blue smudge. Matching the residue on the kid glove from the compost. Colonel Bantry slammed the table. This is persecution. First poison, now salt, next it'll be arsenic in the marmalade. Arsenic was considered, Miss Marple said calmly. But salt is a warning. The murderer returns to the scene not to kill, but to taunt. I can reach you still. Dr. Haydock adjusted his tie. Psychological pressure, classic in cases of someone who enjoys the game, Miss Marple finished. The forged motives, the planted leaf, the raked flower bed, now this. Each act says, I am cleverer than you all. Mr. Clement found his voice. But why? Mrs. Proctor is dead. Dead, yes, Craddock said, but the inquest is Monday. If we charge the wrong person, the real killer walks free. The salt keeps us chasing shadows. Gladys, emboldened, stepped forward. I filled the bowl fresh this morning, sir. From the new tin in the pantry, locked, like you said, but she hesitated. The key ring was on the dresser last night. I saw it when I banked the fire, thought nothing of it. Craddock's jaw tightened. The keys were returned to me Wednesday. Who had access to this house after 6? A silence thick as clotted cream. Miss Marple rose and moved to the pantry. The window pane, bottom left, showed a hairline crack where putty had been disturbed. On the sill, a faint scratch, the mark of a knife blade. She opened the cupboard beneath. The salt cellar, usually on the dresser, stood open, half empty. Beside it, a single white hair, Mrs. Proctor's, caught on the rough wood. Placed here after death, Miss Marple murmured. Our murderer is sentimental, or theatrical. Back in the drawing room, she addressed the circle. The salt was added between midnight and dawn. Footprints? Craddock shook his head. Gravel path, impossible. But the spare boots are missing again. Size 6. Found this morning in the tool shed, soles wet with dew. Colonel Bantry exploded. My gardener's still in hospital. This is witchcraft. Or familiarity, Miss Marple said. Someone who knows the colonel keeps 2 pairs, one for himself, one for odd jobs. Someone who can come and go unseen. Miss Hartnell's lips thinned. The village is full of busybodies. Anyone who knew Mrs. Proctor weighed sugar Monday, forgave debts Tuesday, and planned a surprise bequest Wednesday. Miss Marple interrupted. Our murderer moved faster than gossip. She lifted the new sugar bowl, now salt, and turned it upside down. Beneath the base, scratched faintly with a pin, LP was not the target. 5 gasps. Craddock seized the bowl. The letters were fresh, the porcelain scarred. Then who? The colonel demanded. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the empty chair, Mrs. Proctor's. The person who always sat here, the one who took 2 lumps. But on Tuesday, someone else was intended to taste death. She produced the laboratory report slipped to her by a sympathetic constable. The cyanide dose was calibrated for a lighter victim. Mrs. Proctor weighed 12 stone. The poison would have sickened a 9-stone woman, enough to collapse, not die. Mrs. Proctor's heart did the rest. Dr. Haydock paled. I mean, Miss Marple said, the salt is the second warning. The murderer adjusts the game. Next time, the dose will be lethal and aimed at the true target. Gladys began to cry. But who? Miss Marple looked at each face in turn. The one who has been framed, then unframed, then framed again. The one whose absence from this table would have changed everything. Outside, the sun broke through, gilding the hemlock. The second tea was over, but the pot was far from empty. Chapter 7. The Missing Ledger. Saturday, and the village held its breath. The inquest loomed like a storm cloud over the church hall. The coroner had postponed until Monday, pending further evidence. Heatherbank Cottage stood open to the wind, windows ajar to air the staleness of death. Miss Marple arrived at 9 with a bunch of late roses, white for remembrance, and a quiet determination to find what Mrs. Proctor had hidden. Inspector Craddock met her in the hall. The salt was ordinary table salt, but the blue smudge matches the glove. Same hand. And the scratch on the bowl, LP was not the target, done with a diamond ring. Mrs. Proctor's own engagement ring, missing since Tuesday. Miss Marple nodded. Return to taunt us. The murderer enjoys the theater. They moved upstairs to the bedroom. The desk, rosewood, Queen Anne legs, had been ransacked by police, then tidied by Gladys. The middle drawer, however, was locked. Craddock produced the keyring, the smallest key turned with a click. Inside lay not the expected ledger, but a cavity, and within it, a second slimmer book bound in green leather. Miss Marple lifted it out. Household accounts. LP. The pages were meticulous, coal, groceries, garden seeds, but the final third had been torn out, leaving ragged edges. Someone removed the crucial entries, Craddock said. Or Mrs. Proctor did, Miss Marple replied. Look, the tear is clean, done with a ruler. She suspected tampering and preserved the truth elsewhere. They searched. Under the blotter, nothing. Behind the watercolor of the cottage, a folded sheet in Lavinia's hand, dated the day before her death. To be opened only if I die suddenly. The true ledger is with my solicitor, Mr. Sims. All debts forgiven, bequests as follows. Cottage to the village as a library, $500 each to Colonel Bantry repaid. Dr. Haydock, services. Miss Hartnell, charity. Mr. Clement, organ. Gladys Finch, $50 and a reference. The hemlock is for bees. Trust no forged papers. LP Craddock whistled. She knew. She feared, Miss Marple corrected, and hid the evidence. The forger tore out the pages to create motives that never existed. Downstairs, the drawing-room safe, behind the portrait of Mr. Proctor, yielded the missing leaves taped inside. The entries matched the note. Debts canceled, bequests recorded. Every suspect cleared, on paper. Yet someone had believed the forgeries, or created them to mask a deeper truth. Gladys, polishing the banisters, overheard. She gave me the £50 Tuesday, miss, in an envelope. Said I'd earned it for honesty. Miss Marple smiled. Then the murderer acted too late. The secrets were already safe. Colonel Bantry arrived at 11, blustering about the British Legion meeting. Heard about the salt, outrageous, though I suppose it proves none of us meant Lavinia harm. Or that the harm was meant for another, Miss Merrill said. The colonel frowned. Who? She did not answer. Instead, she opened the green ledger to a blank page at the back. There in fresh ink, a single line. The real target takes one lump. Craddock stared. Written after death? Last night, Miss Marple confirmed. The ink is still tacky. Our murderer returned again, slipped in while we reconstructed the tea. Dr. Haydock burst in, breathless. I've been to the chemist. My cyanide, 5 ounces, was signed out Wednesday. But I was in Much Benham all day. Someone forged my name. The forgery pattern was complete. Miss Hartnell followed, clutching a letter. Posted through my door at dawn. Says I poisoned Lavinia to avoid eviction. Handwriting, hers, but I burned the real waiver myself. Mr. Clement arrived last, pale. Another note in the vestry accuses me of stealing the organ fund, same hand. Miss Marple gathered the letters. The paper was identical, Mrs. Proctor's crested notepaper stolen from the desk. The ink, Parker Quink, black but under magnification, a faint violet sheen. The pen, a swan with a broad nib, pressure heavy on the downstroke. She laid them side by side. Our forger is left-handed, observed the slant, and the diamond scratches on the bowl, made by a ring worn on the left hand. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Who in the circle is left-handed? Miss Marple ticked them off. Colonel, right. Dr. Haydock, right. Miss Hartnell, right. Mr. Clement, she paused. Ambidextrous, but prefers right for writing. Gladys. The maid, listening from the doorway, raised her left hand. Always have been, miss, but I never— No, Miss Marple said gently. You were framed from the start. The glove was too fine for your hands, the boots too large. She turned to the window. The hemlock swayed. The real target takes one lump. Who declined sugar Tuesday but might have been forced to take it another day? Silence. Then Craddock. You, Miss Marple. You take one lump when visiting. Mrs. Proctor always pressed you. Miss Marple inclined her head. Precisely. I was to be the victim. Mrs. Proctor took two unexpectedly because she was distracted by the forged motives. She tasted the poison meant for me. The room spun. Colonel Bantry sank into a chair. But why you? Because I see too much, Miss Marple said simply. Last month I remarked to Lavinia that someone was pruning her roses oddly, cutting blooms at the wrong node. A gardener's error, I thought, but it was a signal. Someone was watching, waiting for me to notice. She opened her handbag and produced a single rose stem, found that morning in her own garden. The cut was identical, slanted left, deep. The murderer is in the village, she said, and the game is not over. Outside, the church clock struck 12. The ledger was found, the motives dissolved, but the shadow lengthened. Chapter 8. The bootprint Sunday dawned with a wind that rattled the windows of Heatherbank Cottage like impatient fingers. Rain had fallen in the night, soft and steady, turning the flower bed beneath the scullery window into a dark mirror. Miss Marple arrived at 8, umbrella dripping, to find Inspector Craddock already on his knees in the mud, a constable shielding him with a golf umbrella. Look, Craddock said, pointing with a pencil. The prints are back, clear as day. The size 6 hobnail impressions began at the scullery sill and marched straight to the compost heap, toward the house this time. Deep in the toe, as though the wearer had leapt down, then paused to close the window. The left boot had a worn patch on the outer edge, the right carried a fresh nick in the heel. Returned after the salt prank, Miss Marple observed. Bold. The house was watched, yet they risked it. Craddock straightened, rain streaking his trilby. The spare boots are still missing. Colonel's pair, size 6, were in the scullery Friday, gone yesterday. They followed the prints. At the compost, the trail ended in a churned patch where something had been buried, then exhumed. Craddock dug with a trowel, a small tin box, rusted, the kind used for biscuits. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, Mrs. Proctor's diamond engagement ring, the missing ledger pages, and a single sheet in the forged hand. Next time, one lump will suffice. Miss Marple lifted the ring. The stone had scratched the sugar bowl. Left-handed pressure, she murmured. The ring was worn on the writing hand. Back inside, Gladys met them, apron clutched. I heard a noise at 3, miss. Thought it was cats. But the scullery light was on, then off. 3 o'clock, Craddock repeated, a moonset, perfect cover. They examined the scullery. The window pane, replaced after the salt intrusion, showed fresh putty, still soft. On the sill, a smear of mud and a single white hair caught on a splinter. Mrs. Proctor's hair again, but she had not left her bed since Tuesday. Planted, Miss Marple said. Like the glove, the leaf, the salt. Our murderer leaves calling cards. Upstairs, the bedroom safe yielded another surprise. Behind the portrait, a second compartment, opened with the same small key. Inside, a sealed envelope addressed to Miss Marple in Lavinia's hand. "If I die, give this to Jane, she will understand." Craddock broke the seal. A single photograph, the tea circle taken last month from the garden. In the foreground, the sugar bowl full. Behind, the suspects in their usual seats, but one figure stood apart, half hidden by the delphiniums, a man in a dark coat, face obscured, left hand raised as if waving. On the back, the watcher. LP Miss Marple studied it. Mrs. Proctor suspected an outsider. Yet the boots, the gloves, the key all belong inside. They descended to the potting shed. The rake leaned against the wall, handle polished smooth. On the bench, a pair of kid gloves left one missing its mate, stained with putty and rose sap. Beside them, a left-handed secateur, blade nicked where it had cut the stem in Miss Marple's garden. Craddock bagged the evidence. The Colonel's gardener is still in hospital. Who else uses this shed? Gladys hesitated. Mrs. Proctor's nephew, Mr. Price. Came last spring to prune the orchard, stayed a week, said he was between posts. Left-handed he was, wore the Colonel's spare boots, said his own pinched. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Nephew? Lavinia mentioned no family. Only the once, Gladys said. Bitter he was. Mrs. Proctor refused to increase his allowance, said he'd squandered his inheritance on greyhounds. Craddock flipped his notebook. Price Edmund, London address. Known to the yard. Small frauds, nothing violent. We'll wire for him. Miss Marple moved to the shed door. Rain had softened the path. A second set of prints, size 9, led from the orchard gate to the shed, then away. Colonel Bantry's own boots, perhaps. But the size 6 prints overlapped them lighter, returning to the house. 2 visitors, she said. One to bury the tin, one to retrieve it. The nephew plants evidence. Another removes it to protect or to redirect. At noon, the suspects gathered again, summoned by telephone. The drawing room fire crackled. The table was bare save for the photograph and the tin box. Colonel Bantry arrived first, dripping. Heard about the nephew, never liked the fellow, sallow, shifty, but murder? Dr. Haydock followed, spectacles fogged. Edmund Price borrowed my darkroom key in June, said he was developing holiday snaps, never returned it. Miss Hartnell clutched her bag. He called on me last month, offered to buy the almshouse cottage, said Lavinia was selling. Lies! Mr. Clement entered last, pale. He attended evensong once. Sat at the back, left a note in the collection plate. Organ fund or else. I thought it a prank. Miss Marple laid the photograph on the table. Mrs. Proctor took this to warn me. The watcher is Mr. Price. He intended my death, knowing I take one lump when pressed. Lavinia took 2, distracted by his forgeries. Her heart failed. Craddock nodded. We've wired London. Price was seen boarding the 7:15 to Much Benham Friday night. Due back today. The clock struck 1. Outside, the rain eased. In the flower bed, the size 6 prints began to blur, but the nick in the heel remained, a signature. Miss Marple lifted the secateur. He will return for this. The game is not finished. Gladys entered with tea, decaf at Miss Marple's insistence. 6 cups, 1 lump in the bowl. The trap was set. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room Denouement. Sunday tea was served at 4 o'clock sharp, though the light outside Heatherbank Cottage had already thinned to pewter. The fire crackled. The Crown Derby pot steamed. The sugar bowl, Wedgwood refilled with innocent crystals, sat in the center of the lace cloth like a dare. 6 cups, 6 saucers, 6 suspects. Miss Marple had insisted on decaf. Inspector Craddock had insisted on plainclothes constables behind the arras. Colonel Bantry arrived first, boots gleaming, mustache bristling. "Dash it, Miss Marple, this is irregular. Tea with a murderer?" "Tea with truth, Colonel," she replied serenely, motioning him to his chair. Dr. Haydock followed, medical bag clutched like a talisman. Miss Hartnell sailed in, hat pinned with military precision. Mr. Clement entered last, dog collar askew, eyes darting to the sugar bowl. Gladys poured with trembling hands, then retreated to the doorway. The sixth chair, Mrs. Proctor's, remained empty, a silent accuser. Craddock stood by the mantel, trilby in hand. "1 lump each, if you please. We recreate Tuesday exactly." Miss Marple lifted the bowl. "Except today, the poison is knowledge." She set it down and produced the evidence in a neat row. The diamond ring, the tin box, the secateurs, the photograph, the forged letters, the kid glove, the hemlock leaf pressed between glass. "Let us begin with the boots," she said. "Size 6 borrowed from the scullery, the left heel nicked. Here." She tapped the secateur. "The same nick appears on the rose stem left in my garden. The wearer is left-handed, weight 9 stone, height 5'6". Not the colonel, not the doctor, not Miss Hartnell, not Mr. Clement. Gladys is 5'2", so who? Silence. "The nephew, Edmund Price," Craddock supplied. "Seen boarding the train Friday, due any moment." Miss Marple shook her head. "Mr. Price is the means, not the mind. He forged the letters, planted the leaf, swapped the salt. But he did not choose the victim. He believed the motives were real. Believed Lavinia would disinherit him unless the suspects were ruined first. Someone fed him the forgeries, the schedule, the keys." Colonel Bantry frowned. "Then who—" Miss Marple turned to the empty chair. "The person who sat here every Tuesday for 20 years, who knew I take 1 lump when pressed. Who knew Lavinia took 2 only when distracted. Who knew the spare boots, the gloves, the dark room key, the putty, the secateur." She lifted the photograph. "Mrs. Proctor took this to warn me of the watcher, Mr. Price. But the watcher was invited. Someone wrote to him in London, summoned him, equipped him." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "But Lavinia died because she intercepted the poison meant for me." Miss Marple's voice was soft steel. "On Tuesday, she was agitated, reading forged letters Price had planted in her desk. She took 2 lumps to steady her nerves. The dose was calibrated for my 9 stone, not her 12. Her heart failed from shock and cyanide combined." Miss Hartnell gasped. "Then the murderer is still among us." Miss Marple's gaze swept the circle. "The salt was a warning to me. The scratched message, LP, was not the target, a taunt. The tin box buried, then retrieved. The rose stem in my garden. All to say, I can reach you any time." Mr. Clement whispered, "But who benefits?" Miss Marple opened the green ledger to the final page, the forged line in fresh ink. "The real target takes 1 lump. Someone who wished me silent. Last month I remarked to Lavinia that the pruning was odd. Left-handed cuts, deep, wasteful. A gardener's error, I thought. But it was a signal. Someone feared I had noticed them." She produced a final item, a single white hair mounted on card. "From the scullery sill, Mrs. Proctor's, planted. But under the microscope, died. The root is dark. Mrs. Proctor's hair was white to the scalp." Gladys gave a small cry. Miss Marple turned to her. "You are 19, Gladys. Your mother's hair is auburn, yours too. But your aunt in Tunbridge Wells, Mrs. Proctor's former companion, dyed her hair white to match Lavinia's after she left service. She visited last spring, stayed a week, used the spare boots, the secateur, the dark room. She wrote to her nephew Edmund in London. Come, inherit, ruin the suspects. She forged the motives, summoned him, equipped him. But Lavinia discovered the plan, hid the true ledger, wrote to me. So the aunt poisoned the sugar, knowing I would be pressed to take 1 lump at the next tea. Gladys sank to her knees. Aunt Edith? But she's in Canada. Edith Finch, née Price, Craddock said, producing a telegram. Detained at Southampton docks this morning. Sailing ticket booked Wednesday. Confession all ready. Says she acted alone, but the pruning, the boots, the putty, all match. Miss Marple shook her head. Not alone. Gladys, stand up, child, your aunt used you. The glove on the shelf, the hair from Lavinia's brush planted in the compost. You were to be the scapegoat if Price failed. Gladys wept. She wrote to me, said Mum needed money for the passage. I let her in Monday night, thought she only wanted keepsakes. Miss Marple patted her shoulder. You are forgiven. The true murderer is the woman who turned family into weapon. Craddock signaled. 2 constables entered from the hall, escorting a thin woman in a gray coat. Edith Finch, white hair dyed, left hand gloved. The diamond ring glinted. Edith, Colonel Bantry spluttered, you were Lavinia's companion. 20 years, she spat. Dismissed for a broken teacup. She kept the cottage, the garden, the friends. I got a reference and a passage to nowhere. Edmund was to inherit, then Lavinia changed her will to a library. So I forged the motives, summoned him, poisoned the sugar for the nosy old woman who saw too much. She glared at Miss Marple. 1 lump would have sufficed. Miss Marple met her gaze. But Lavinia took 2. And love of garden, of village, of truth proved stronger than cyanide. Edith was led away. The fire popped. Outside, the rain had stopped. Miss Marple lifted the teapot. Now shall we have a proper cup? 1 lump, no more. The circle exhaled. The empty chair remained, but the shadows had lifted. Chapter 10. Morning tea and marmalade. A week later, the first Tuesday in September, Heatherbank Cottage opened its drawing-room windows to a morning so bright it seemed the village itself had been rinsed clean. The police tape was gone, the wreath replaced by a pot of scarlet geraniums. The Crown Derby teapot, washed, polished, and filled with proper Darjeeling, presided over the round table exactly as it had for 20 years. 6 cups, 6 saucers, 1 sugar bowl brimming with innocent crystals. The 7th chair, Mrs. Proctor's, stood empty, but a small vase of white roses rested upon it, tied with lavender ribbon. Miss Marple arrived at 10 sharp, basket over her arm. She wore dove-gray wool and the faintest smile as though the world had righted itself on its axis. Colonel Bantry was already installed, boots gleaming, mustache waxed to military points. Dr. Haydock followed, spectacles polished, a new lightness in his step. Miss Hartnell sailed in with a fresh hat. No cherry this time, but a modest spray of heather. Mr. Clement brought a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Sheet music for the restored organ. Gladys, apron starched, curls tamed beneath her cap, poured with steady hands. Inspector Craddock lingered by the door in mufti, invited purely as a friend. He accepted a cup but declined sugar with a wink. Decaf? The colonel boomed, stirring in 2 lumps with theatrical caution. Proper tea, Miss Marple assured him. The laboratory returned the Wedgwood bowl yesterday. Not a trace of salt, cyanide, or hemlock. Gladys set down the teapot and produced a plate of scones. Golden, fragrant, still warm from the range. Cook's recipe, miss. Mrs. Proctor's own. A murmur of approval rippled round the table. The colonel buttered lavishly. Dashed fine spread, though I still say salt in the sugar was excessive. Miss Hartnell sniffed. Better salt than cyanide, Colonel. Mr. Clement unwrapped his parcel. The organ fund, 200 anonymous plus Mrs. Proctor's bequest. We dedicate the new stops to her memory next Sunday. Dr. Haydock raised his cup. To Lavinia, who forgave debts, planted roses, and kept the bees happy. Miss Marple lifted hers. And to truth, which always rises with the steam. Outside, the garden glowed, delphiniums rebuilt, Roses pruned correctly, right-handed now by the Colonel's new gardener. The hemlock along the bank had been dug up by the Women's Institute and replaced with lavender. The scullery window gleamed with fresh putty and a shiny new latch. Conversation flowed like the tea, gentle, villagey, comforting. The new postmistress had been seen cycling before dark. The butcher's wife was expecting. The harvest festival would feature Gladys's prize chutney. No one mentioned London or docks or confessions. Edith Finch and her nephew were safely in custody. The forged letters had been burned in the vicarage grate. The diamond ring returned to the solicitor for the library fund. At 10:30, Gladys brought in the post on a silver tray. Among the seed catalogs and church circulars lay a single envelope addressed in Lavinia's spidery hand, forwarded by Mr. Sims. Inside, a brief note and a pressed hemlock leaf, now brittle and harmless. "My dear friends," it read, "if you are reading this, the cottage is yours. Use it well. The bees will miss me, but the roses will not. One lump, no more. L.P." Miss Marple tucked the leaf between the pages of her pocket Shakespeare. She always did have the last word. The Colonel cleared his throat. "Library, eh? Capital idea. I'll donate my bound punch, 1880 to 1914. Dr. Haydock offered his medical journals. Miss Hartnell promised her embroidery patterns. Mr. Clement pledged the vestry hymnals." Gladys, blushing, added her mother's recipe book. Miss Marple opened her basket. "And I shall contribute my collection of village histories, though I fear some chapters are still being written." Laughter, soft, healing, filled the room. Outside, a blackbird began its autumn song. The sun climbed higher, gilding the lace curtains, the teacups, the faces of friends who had survived suspicion and emerged kinder. At 11, the Colonel raised his cup one final time. "To absent friends, and to present ones," Miss Marple added. Gladys poured the last of the pot. "Apricot jam today, ma'am?" Miss Marple smiled. "One spoonful, dear, and no kernels." The clock on the mantel struck the quarter. St. Mary Mead dozed in the September haze, secrets safely steeped and strained. The Tuesday tea circle was restored, minus one chair plus one library and sweetened only with sugar.